Did everyone that had their blood drawn get their results back? Let me rephrase the question. Is there anyone who had their blood drawn who did not get their results back? Anyone? Okay, if you're not here, raise your hand. Okay, all right. This is what we'll do. I realize there are some people who have, if you got your blood drawn on Tuesday, let's see, when was the first blood draw? It was Monday, right? So if you had your blood drawn on Tuesday morning, there are some results that were preliminary results, which means that they're missing a couple of things that will come usually later on in the day. So if you're one of those people who have, if you see something that says will follow or it says prelim somewhere on your paper, then we'll print your final one as soon as we get it, but we don't have it yet. But for the vast majority of people, as far as everything that I've seen, everyone should have final results in. Okay? I'd like to begin with a word of prayer because we need God's help in all things. What do you say? All right, let's pray. Our Father in heaven, you are the great physician, and so we come seeking your wisdom as we go over these things. I am not the expert, nor am I worthy to stand here, and so we ask that Christ would be seen today, and that you would help us to understand and to know what to do. In Jesus' name, amen. In Leviticus chapter 17, in verse 11, this is familiar to many people. It says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." And that's why we look at blood. We look at blood because it gives us an indication of what's going on in the body. Okay? So, can you all see that? Okay. But those of you who have your blood work in front of you, you can see it. I'm just going to have this up here so I can kind of point certain things out. So, how much time do I have in this? I didn't really look at the schedule. It's 10:30 till 11:30? Okay. So, we should be able to get through it. Now, I realize that everyone has, let me just say this up front, so you can't say I didn't tell you. Everyone has different results. Okay? Different doesn't mean bad. Different doesn't mean good. Different means different. That's what it means. So if you have something different than what we're saying, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to collapse right now. But just, nobody freak out, okay? But there are some things that maybe, that maybe one would need to pay attention to. And so those are the type of things that we'll highlight as we go along, okay? And again, if anyone has further questions, we are not going to do individual consults right here, right now. You heard me say it, right? We're not doing individual consults right here, right now. If anyone has further questions, make an appointment. If you want to sit down with one of our medical staff, we will be having a panel with all of our available medical staff here right after this. And so maybe that might be a more appropriate time to ask questions, but right now, for time's sake, if you can help me on this, we can get through the blood work and write down your questions, and we can try to answer them in an appropriate way. Does that make sense? Everyone with me so far? Okay, good. So you'll see, give a quick orientation to what your papers look like. So look on the first page, and make sure it's your name. All right, does everyone see your name on the paper? Good. If you don't see your name, there's a problem from our end. So you should see your name, your date of birth, and all that stuff in this area here at the top left. And now I'll give a quick orientation to what each thing is. So if you look here on the first, this first part here, this first column, where it says test, right? And so that's the name of the test. Right next to it, you'll see the column for result, okay? Next to that, you'll see what's called a flag. A flag doesn't mean good or bad. It just means if something is outside of the normal range, the lab puts a flag. It says this is high, this is low, okay? The next thing is the units. That's the unit of measurement, okay? And the next thing there is the reference interval. This is what the lab considers normal. Okay? Now, what the lab considers normal is not necessarily the most healthy thing. And I'll tell you why. Because the lab's reference range is based on the average American, and the average American is not very healthy, right? So there are some things that, as we go along, you'll see there's some things that will say, this is just fine. And then there's other things that, as we go along, we'll say, well, it looks like it's in the normal range, but this is better, okay? So here, we're going to start right at the top where it says glucose. This is your blood sugar level, okay? And you'll see the result here. Now, the reference range says up to 99, and most doctors would say, well, that's just fine. The reality is, the longer your blood sugar floats in the 90s, the more likely you are to have diabetes, eventually, even if you're not diabetic, okay? I've seen people here who have blood sugars in the 90s, and no one would say they're very diabetic. They weren't very diabetic. Actually, they were pre-diabetic. But they were having severe neuropathy symptoms. And so you can still have diabetic complications even with mild diabetes. Okay, so you want to keep the best range for the glucose, fasting blood glucose, would be in the 70s to 80. So up to 89, but not higher than that. Okay? 70s to 80s is good for glucose. The hemoglobin A1C right below that, this is your average, the average blood sugar control over the last 3 months. So if you think you can cheat the doctor by skipping, supper for a couple of nights, yeah, it could work. But if you've been eating big suppers for the last 3 months, it's going to show, okay? It's going to show. And so here you can see the pre-diabetic range is 5.7 to 6.4. Anything above 6.4 is considered diabetes, okay? And of course, the longer your blood sugar stays high, the more likely the diabetes is to set in. Uric acid is right below that. It's a byproduct of cellular functions, cellular metabolisms. And people with gout have an issue where their uric acid is high and forms crystals, and they have all kinds of problems. I don't see a huge problem with it being low, but particularly if it's high, then you want to watch out, especially if you have gout. People with gout, you don't want to do a whole lot of fasting because you can have a flare-up during that time of fasting. So that would be something to just watch out for, especially since we talked so much about fasting this week. Okay. Moving down to the next one. Now, these next few are going to be your kidney function tests. Okay? So your BUN, blood urea nitrogen, I like to see that more in the single digits. Okay? So if you have a BUN up at 20, you're probably a bit dehydrated, and you want to push that down. Now, there's multiple factors here. There's the creatinine. This is the most important thing when it comes to kidney function is your creatinine. Creatinine is the byproduct of the breakdown of proteins, okay? And your kidneys filter it out. And so if it's backing up in your blood, then you know your kidneys are not filtering it out efficiently, right? And so if your creatinine is higher than 1, then you know something's going on. Now, just because the creatinine's high doesn't mean your kidneys are failing, because creatinine can increase when you increase your exercise. For example, somebody who goes and starts lifting weights where they've never lifted weights before, their creatinine could go up, okay? Or if you start, running or whatever, and you start breaking down muscles, then yes, your creatinine could potentially go up. So by itself, it's not automatically saying, bam, you have kidney failure just because of that. So that's why we look at multiple tests. So there's the BUN, there's the creatinine, there's the GFR, glomerular filtration rate, and it's adjusted for if you're black or if you're not black. And so as long as it's above 60, it's fine. Okay, and that's basically just a calculation that's based on the creatinine. If you're, I can't even remember off the top of my head what the exact cutoff points are for each stage of renal failure, but basically the lower that number is, the further into renal failure one is, and that is, of course, based on the creatinine. Your BUN creatinine ratio, That's the one right below that as well. And you also want that one low. So you want the BUN in the single digits. You want the creatinine to be on the lower end of normal. And you want, your creatinine on the lower end of normal. And you want your BUN creatinine ratio also on the lower end of normal. If you see the BUN creatinine ratio high and the creatinine high and the GFR low and the BUN high, then you know, okay, there's something going on with the kidneys that we need to check out. Okay? Everyone clear? If the BUN is too low, we're not really concerned with that. It's not a problem. Okay? Because I saw a couple of those around. Below that we have your electrolytes. We have sodium. That's your salt. So if it's too high, you know it's time to stay off of the salt. Take the salt shaker off the table. If it's too low, maybe you could have a little bit of salt. That's your sodium, your potassium, chloride, carbon dioxide, calcium. Okay? And if any of those things are off, then you could have problems, of course, with electrolyte imbalances. There are all kinds of issues which you don't want to have. So make sure those things are in range. Below that, you have your proteins. You have, and amongst the proteins, the ones that they check for is albumin and globulin. Your globulins are your antibodies. On this person's, of course, it's fine. Okay? And then they have a ratio of that, the albumin to globulin ratio, because you don't want just the right amount, but you want the right ratio of the albumin to globulin. Okay? Below that is your bilirubin. Bilirubin is a byproduct of the breakdown of red cells, erythrocytes, and they go out in the bile. And so if you have a bile obstruction, meaning gallstones or something like that going on, you could have, or usually the obstruction is in the bile ducts itself, and you could have bilirubin that backs up as a result of that. Or if you have hemolysis, which is red cells that are being broken down in excess, then you could have an elevated bilirubin as well. Where did I go? I lost my place. There we go. Okay. Then we have the alkaline phosphatase. These are liver enzymes. Alkaline phosphatase, AST, ALT, GGT. They're all different liver enzymes. Alkaline phosphatase, you can see an elevation in that. People who have cancer, for example, sometimes, or many times, they'll have alkaline phosphatase elevations if they have bone metastases. But I've seen people who have bone metastases whose alkaline phosphatase was in the normal range as well. So it's not, I wouldn't use that as a, as a marker just for that. But just know it's a liver enzyme. GGT is the one that they actually use for monitoring people on alcohol addiction recovery. So as long as all of those are in the normal range, then your liver is doing well. If one of them is elevated, it doesn't matter which one, but if one of them is elevated but the rest of them are normal, your liver's probably fine, but it's just that it's working harder for some reason. So either it's dealing with some toxins or something. Oftentimes people who are fasting for a certain period of time, their liver enzymes might go up because their liver is now processing more. It's doing a lot more during that time, the gluconeogenesis and all that stuff that's going on. Below that, so that's kidneys. Oops, what's happening? Yeah. Oh, stop it. So that's kidneys, and that's liver. And now we're going down to your iron profile. So the TIBC, how do I explain this without... I usually have a drawing board to explain this. Your TIBC basically reflects how many of those available spots you have for iron to sit in. So here's my analogy. My analogy is, this is the chapel here. And let's say in this person's case, there's 283 seats that are available, okay? Oops, how do I go to the next page? Next? No, there it is. All right, hold on 1 second. Okay, and then the UIBC, which would be the unbound spot. So UIBC would be how many empty seats we have here. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the serum iron would be how many seats are currently being occupied. And in this case, if this was the analogy, this bench would be the ferritin and you would be iron. Okay? All right, so the serum iron are basically, that's how many, the serum iron is how much iron is actually bound with the ferritin. And of course, they have a percentage of that as well. So you want to make sure that is in the appropriate range. And if not, if it's too low, then you might need an iron supplement, or you might need to take in some foods that have iron, such as black starch molasses and spinach and annatto seeds. These kind of things that can help to boost your iron. What's that? Oh, beets. Yes, thank you. Beets, carrots, things like that. Yes. Annatto seeds. It's good question. It's a seed. I don't know exactly what it is, but I just know it's higher in iron. Yes. Oh, is that what they use it for coloring food, huh? I didn't know that's what they use it for. Ah. Cool. I just learned something new. Thank you. So it's used for, she says it's used a lot for food coloring. I didn't know that's what they use it for because we just use it for boosting iron. So, sorry, was there? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. You can find it at health food stores, or I guess you can find it at the dollar store. I didn't know that. Or regular stores. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So if it's terribly low, like if your iron levels are like really low, like down at 7% or something like that, then you probably need to be taking an iron supplement, which would be like ferrous sulfate is probably one of the best ones. And if your iron is too high, it's possible that you're eating a meat diet, and you probably need to back off of that. Okay. Below that, you can see your B12 and your folic acid, which is B9. And there's 3 B vitamins that we're really concerned with when it comes to homocysteine metabolism, which we'll talk about later on. So your B12, we actually normally see when people come here to the center and they just eat while we're eating, we usually see their B12 skyrocket without supplementation. And that's within like a week. So you can increase your B vitamins just with your diet. However, if you have multiple B vitamins that are low, it may not be a bad idea to temporarily be on a B complex, which would cover multiple B vitamins. Yes. You had a question? Yeah, some people, thank you. There are some people who have very, very high B12. As far as I know, there isn't a major problem with it being that high. If anything, the body will use it as a storehouse and just use it up. Yes. Mm-hmm. Then you'd make a good blood donor. Uh-huh. Well, we'll talk a little bit more. Okay. Okay. Let's see. What are we on? Okay. Folic acid is B9. That's another one that you can get from your diet. You can eat, beans, things like that. A lot. Those are all excellent for this kind of thing. Yep. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Uh-huh. No, if the B12 is outside of the upper range, it's usually fine. Yeah, it's not. We don't know any pathological significance with that. And even the folate being above, I think it'll just say above 20 or something like that. If that's the case, then that's fine as well. Okay, the next thing is vitamin D. And most humans that I have seen are low in vitamin D. And so we all need to get out in the sun. And so if you're low in vitamin D, of course, I probably don't even have to explain this one, but there are many things that are associated with low vitamin D levels, many lifestyle diseases, depression, lots of things. You can even look at what happens to people in the parts of the world where they don't get sun for several months, and they have serious psychological issues that go on as a result. Depression is one of the big ones, but there are other things as well, and they actually found that vitamin D sufficiency is associated with longevity. And when they say sufficiency, they're not saying 30, which is the lower end. They're talking about closer to 70. So if you just barely made the cut, you still need more sun, okay? If you barely made the cut, you can afford to be on a vitamin D supplement or just get out in the sun, okay? Next thing down here, now this is one that I want you all to pay attention to. And this is the one where probably most people who come to a place like this need help in, is the cholesterol, okay? So you can see the total cholesterol. We like to see it less than 150. So if it's above that, you might need help. But of course, total cholesterol isn't all bad cholesterol. So let's break it down. You have the triglycerides. The triglycerides are the fat molecules. This is the danger one, okay? If triglycerides are elevated, this is the one that will that will predict whether you will develop insulin resistance, which is diabetes type 2. Okay, triglyceride elevation is like one of the biggest lifestyle issues that we see. Okay, so you want to make sure to get your triglycerides down. How do you do that? Well, we talked about fasting, right? Fasting after your liver breaks down glycogen from the liver, from the muscles, then it turns eventually it turns to triglycerides in the body, and it breaks down triglycerides, which are the fat molecules, okay? And so fasting works really quickly with triglyceride elevation, but other things is exercising, eating the right foods. Let's talk about the rest of the cholesterol, and we'll come back to this. HDL, which is the good cholesterol. So just remember H for high. What did I say? H for high. And just remember, if you want the good cholesterol higher, okay? And the HDL acts like a magnet to attract the LDL, which is the bad cholesterol. So I'm going to skip this VLDL and go to the LDL. We'll come back to the VLDL. The LDL is the quote-unquote bad cholesterol, okay? This is the cholesterol that gets easily oxidized. And so what happens is you actually have white blood cells which will come and phagocytize or eat that LDL, and it actually ingests it, and it becomes a sticky blob, and it gets stuck inside your blood vessels. We call that, anyone know what it's called? Plaque, yeah. It becomes plaque, yeah. And that plaque builds up, and there's an inflammatory response associated with it, which is what the next thing is, the C-reactive protein, which is an inflammation marker specifically within the blood vessels. It tends to be elevated in people who have chronic disease or who have a lot of plaque going on. Now this, I said that we would go back to the VLDL. The VLDL goes along with the triglycerides because it's a transport molecule. So it carries the triglycerides from the liver out to wherever you see triglycerides building up, right? So you always want your HDL higher than your LDL. Does that make sense? So if you see the HDL much lower than the LDL, a lot of people will have like HDLs of like 30s or something, and the LDLs will be at 100 something, right? So we gotta flip that, right? And the best way to do that, fasting works really well, really, really well, but not everyone can fast. I understand that. Here's the secret. Cholesterol only comes from animal products, okay? You and I genetically make different amounts of cholesterol from each other, right? But the animals do the same thing. So when I'm making my own amount of cholesterol and then I'm eating an animal or drinking their milk or whatever, then I'm adding their cholesterol on top of my cholesterol. Does that make sense? So we don't want that. So one of the easy fixes for this, just abstain from animal products. I say animal products, not just meat. It means, yes, cheese, eggs is a big one. And some people think that just by eating the egg whites, they're healthier. But it's actually not true. There is cholesterol that diffuses out into the white part. A lot of people don't know that, but it's true. So there is cholesterol in basically anything involved with animals will be cholesterol. If you're trying to lower it, I say, why try to build up some while you're trying to lose it, Just cut it out. It's simple, right? And so that's the cholesterol spiel. And by the way, the with diabetes and things like that, it's not so much of the it's not so much that the sugars are high as much as it is the fat, these triglycerides. These triglycerides are the problem. So if we can control that, with our diet, with our lifestyle, getting out, getting some exercise. By the way, exercise raises HDL, the good cholesterol. So if you exercise more, you'll raise that HDL, and the HDL lowers the LDL. So you can see how the whole lifestyle affects this one thing. So we can really tell how someone's lifestyle is going just by looking at their cholesterol, pretty much. So exercise raises the HDL. Fasting, of course, diet, staying away from animal products, that'll normalize this whole thing. Next thing down here is homocysteine. C-reactive protein, we spoke about it a little bit. That's basically an inflammation marker, specifically within the blood vessels. Okay. I'm sorry? For C-reactive protein, 0. 0 is optimal, but if there is some inflammation going on, again, it tells us there's the process going on. What does that mean? I don't know. It could mean that there's plaque buildup. It could mean there's chronic disease or something like that. But it's just that there is some inflammation going on in the vasculature. Below that is your homocysteine. And there's another inflammation marker that we'll look at later on, so we can compare the two. The next one is homocysteine. Homocysteine is an amino acid that has... Yes? Mm-hmm. Right. So like I said, for the total cholesterol, you want to keep it below 150. Ideally, 120 to 150 is usually pretty good. Triglycerides, the lower the better. HDL, the higher the better. LDL, the lower than the HDL, the better. And so we're looking for each person it'll be different, but for HDL, you want it above 40 at least, and your LDL, you want it to be below whatever your HDL level is. So yes, you can keep it, the lower the better.
All right. So typically too much oil in the diet is one factor, and that can be whether in cooking, and yes, it could be olive oil or coconut oil. It could be in, we'll get there. It could be in condiments, salad dressings, margarines, vegetable shortening, other types of things like that, any type of oil that's been refined from its product. The second area where it's most likely is nuts. So individuals are eating too much nuts. The research shows that nuts are very helpful, but not too much of them. So about a handful for the day. And so some people have a handful for one meal, and then they have a handful for another meal, and then they have almond milk, and then they have cashew cheese sauce, and then they have pecan balls, and and then they have nut loaf, and so they have nuts all over the place. So that's the other one. And then the third one, there is an entity called stress-induced hypercholesterolemia. Mm-hmm. And so stress can increase the liver's production of bad cholesterol as well. So those are the three big factors for somebody on a completely plant-based diet.
Thank you. Okay, so these kind of questions are the ones that we're saving for the panel right after, okay? Everyone, please, because we got to get through this. Like I said, we will write down your questions if you have personal type of questions like that, and we'll try to answer them by God's grace in the next segment, okay? Homocysteine is the next one right here. And again, that's an amino acid, and it is involved in many different biochemical pathways in the body. Elevated homocysteine levels are usually associated with Alzheimer's, dementia, cardiovascular disease, in females, cervical cancer, colorectal cancer. Those things are indicated there. Now, the ideal number, if you want to aim for homocysteine, would be closer to 6 or 7. Don't despair if it's not there. Look at your B12 and your folic acid. There are 3 main vitamins, B vitamins, that are involved in homocysteine metabolism. B12, B6, which is pyridoxine, we did not test for that, and B9, which is folic acid. And so if you want to lower your homocysteine and you see that you could afford to take some B vitamins, then get a B complex, okay, or eat more vegetables. So the next thing here is your TSH, your thyroid stimulating hormone. It's a hormone put out by your pituitary gland, tells your thyroid that it's time to work and time to produce some thyroid hormone, okay? And so if you see this TSH high, it's like this gland is shouting at your thyroid, saying, "Hey, we need more hormone," right? So if you see it very high, then it means your thyroid is functioning low, hypothyroidism. Okay, and if you see the TSH low, then it could indicate that your thyroid is functioning high. Okay, but it's not by itself an indicator. There are other further tests you could do, free T3, free T4, and that you would have to check for those things if your TSH is one way or the other. Below that is the insulin level. This is the next big one when it comes to lifestyle diseases. Okay, so here are the big things we look at. Remember from the first page, we look at glucose right at the top, and then we looked at hemoglobin A1C, right? And then the next thing we look at when it comes to these things, of course, is triglycerides is the other thing, and then insulin levels. Insulin levels, you want to see, now this person has some really good insulin at, 4.4, which is great. If your insulin is not, let's say, if your blood sugar is in the normal range, quote unquote, if it's around the 80s or so, or even in the 90s, but your insulin is like at 30, then you know that you probably have some insulin resistance, and if you flip over to your cholesterol, your triglycerides are probably high as well. Okay? But if you look and you see that your blood sugars are in the normal range, your hemoglobin A1C is in the normal range, your triglycerides are okay, and your insulin levels are down, 4s to 6s or so, you're probably okay. Now, if the insulin is very, very low, like less than 2, but all your blood sugar levels and everything else is normal, then sometimes that can actually be normal. Some people just, produce small amounts and then they produce it as needed. I've seen that. But if your insulin levels are very, very low, less than 2, but your blood sugar levels are very, very high, then that's concerning. And if your hemoglobin A1C is high, then that's concerning for type 1 diabetes. Even if a person was type 2, they can eventually become type 1 because the beta islet cells of the pancreas start burning themselves out eventually from producing so much insulin, right? And then they actually stop working. So that is concerning if the insulin is very, very high or very, very low, but it's only concerning if it's very low if the blood sugars and everything are very, very high. That makes sense? Everyone with me? All right. Below that, we have your CBC, your complete blood count, with the differential. And so what does that mean? Well, complete blood count is the breakdown of your white blood cells and your red blood cells, okay? The different types of your white blood cells and what your red cells look like, okay? So right at the top, WBC stands for white blood cells. For people on a plant-based diet or on a fairly healthy lifestyle, we like to see those in the 3s to 6s. So if it's much higher than that, like let's say your white blood cells are out at like 10 or 11, then something might be going on. Okay, sometimes it's because of infection, or other times it's just, I don't know, it just tends to be higher in people who are eating like an animal diet and things like that. Below that you have your RBCs, your red blood cells, and as long as those are in the good range, then that's good. If you know that if you see them and they're too low, then we need to understand why. Sometimes it could be because there's hemorrhaging, there's bleeding going on somewhere, and if those red blood cells are very high, red cells being high, I usually see them with people who are on a higher meat diet. I don't know, Dr. Mark, if you had any other comment on high red cells?
A higher meat diet, that can be associated with individuals that are taking too much iron. They're maybe highly absorbing iron, or they're taking iron supplementation, and the iron levels have become high, so the red blood cell count's going to be high. And then sometimes with certain conditions, like maybe thalassemias, then you can have a high red blood cell count with a normal hemoglobin and hematocrit because the red blood cells are small. And so the the bone marrow is overproducing the small red blood cells in order to keep the hemoglobin and hematocrit normal.
The hemoglobin right below that is that's the thing that carries oxygen, and it usually sits in the red cells. And so as long as that's in the normal range, you're good. If it's a little low, then we wonder why. Many times it's because of an iron deficiency. We would call this anemia. But other times it may not be necessarily because of an iron deficiency. Sometimes, again, like because of excessive bleeding or things like that. The hematocrit right below that, this is the volume of your red cells in your total blood. So it's the amount of space that your red cells take up. So in your blood, you have red cells, white cells, platelets, plasma, all this stuff, right? Your hematocrit is just the amount of space that just the red cells take up in relation to the total blood, okay? And so if you see that when you have bigger red cells, that hematocrit might be a little higher. If you have smaller red cells, the hematocrit might be a little lower. If you have less red cells, the hematocrit might be lower. And if you have more red cells, the hematocrit might be higher, okay? Because it just reflects how much space it takes up. The MCV stands for mean corpuscular volume. Don't worry, there's no test on this afterwards. And MCV, it just reflects the size of the red cells, okay? So if you see that that's out of range, if it's too low, it don't despair. It just means that you might have red cells that are just a little bit smaller. Does that make sense? And if your MCV is high, then it just says that your red cells are a little bit bigger than average. Okay. MCH stands for mean corpuscular hemoglobin, and that's a fancy term that just means how much hemoglobin there is per red cell. Okay, how much hemoglobin per red cell is available. The next part here is your RDW. RDW stands for red cell distribution width, and that represents the variances in the shapes of your red cells. So you want them to be within that range, and that reflects that it's fairly uniform. If it's high or low for some reason, if it's higher, that usually will indicate that you have more variation in the shapes of the red cells. That could be for different reasons. If you have like older red cells circulating with some of the newer red cells, and because their membranes are less stable, the older ones, or in certain conditions like sickle cell anemia or things like that, where the actual shape of the red cell is affected. The next thing here is your platelets, okay? And your platelets are the sticky stuff. It's formed in your bone marrow, and it causes your blood to coagulate, to clot, right? So that's why you're not bleeding out all over the place right now, right? It's because you have some platelets. If your platelets are low, then first of all, if your platelets are high, then you are at an increased risk for blood clots, okay? And that could be blood clots in anywhere, okay? And if your platelets are low, then you have an increased risk of hemorrhaging or bleeding, right? And so if it's, I don't remember, Dr. Mark, do you remember what the critically low range was for platelets?
Yeah. When platelets are low, if it's below 50, so if the number is below 50, then an individual can have difficulties with bleeding complications with trauma. Mm-hmm. But if it has to get down to about 10 to 20 in order for you to have bleeding complications without trauma. So most individuals that we find that have low platelets are usually in the 80s or 90s or so. And if that's been the case for a long time, then it's usually not a concern. It is a concern when it's something that's new, because there can be autoimmune condition that is destroying the platelets, or something that's going on in the bone marrow that's affecting its production.
Right. Or if your platelets suddenly drop, then that's an indication that, okay, we need to check something out.
Right. And one other thing with the high platelets is it can be a sign that there's some significant stressor that is going on in the body system somewhere. Doesn't tell us what, but it does say that there's some significant stress or that is going on in the body.
Yeah. We often see, again, I'm going to say this, but don't despair if you see this, but I'm just saying this, that many times we see people with breast cancer and they would have very, very high platelets or different types of cancers. And like Dr. Mark says, because there's a heavy stressor on the body that's going on. Below this is the next part, which are the different types of white cells. So we have the neutrophils, which are good for handling bacterial type of infections. And so if they're high and your lymphocytes are low, then we might think that you have a type of a bacterial infection going on. If any of your white cells around here are depressed for some reason, or if you have multiple ones that are depressed, then we know there is something going on. There's some disease that the body is losing to or trying to fight. Okay, but if you see that, now I forgot to say something. You'll notice that they call this part the differential. The types of white cells are expressed as a percentage here, and then below that an absolute value. So it's listed twice, but it's really the same thing. And we have to do that because sometimes you could have a percentage that might be high, but the actual count of it is normal. Why? Because maybe the total white cell count is low. So anything that seems a little higher than normal would be a higher percentage because the amount of white cells rather are less. I hope that makes sense. So we have your neutrophils, then you have lymphocytes, which are good for handling viral infections. Okay, so if you see those elevated and the neutrophils down, that's a viral pattern. Okay, then you have monocytes, which are these, big white cells, good for handling lots of things. Then you have below that eosinophils and basophils. These can be elevated in allergic reactions, and specifically with eosinophils, I think it's eosinophils especially with parasitic infections. Okay, so you want to make sure that those are in the normal ranges as well. And again, when you're looking at them, we don't just look at the percentage, but we look at the percent and compare it with the actual count. Okay, so if you see that the count is up and the percent is up, then it's elevated. But if one of them are low but the other one is normal, then it's probably okay. All right. So and again, it's all based on how many total white cells you have available. So so again, eosinophils, basophils with allergic reactions especially, and parasitic infections for eosinophils. Immature granulocytes is the immature white cells that are. These are the immature white cells that are called into action. So, for example, when there's a war, there's a draft, right? If we don't have enough soldiers, there's a draft. So this is kind of like our draft. If you need more soldiers, if you see an elevation in immature granulocytes, it's usually an early indication that there's some infection coming on that the body is getting ready to deal with. And then the last thing down here is your Westergren sedimentation rate. That's a marker of inflammation as well. It doesn't tell us where the inflammation is, but it tells us there is some inflammatory process going on. So people who have inflammatory diseases, there's autoimmune diseases, there's, rheumatoid arthritis, different things like that, where you can see the C-reactive protein, which is the marker of inflammation we saw right below your cholesterol. Remember that one? And so that one tends to be elevated with people with chronic disease. But if you have that and you have the sedimentation rate up, we know there's a definite inflammatory process going on, right? Things that tend to drive up sed rates, there's all kinds of things, anything really can, but something that tends to really make it skyrocket is boils or abscesses. That tends to shoot those up really high. Trauma can do this. There's a number of things that could cause sed rates to go up. Again, you want them, the lower the better, the closer to 0, the better. And there's lots of things we can do. from a lifestyle standpoint to help to control inflammation, right? There's lots of, really a plant-based diet is an anti-inflammatory diet, right? And so we usually will see people who come through a program will usually see all their inflammatory markers pretty much decrease. Why? Because this is representing what we're doing to our bodies, whether it's eating at the wrong times or eating the wrong foods or whatever, right? Or it's just reflecting, whatever the disease process is going on.